Hi, my name's Tracy. I'm with the company Symantec Communications here in Montreal, Canada. So you can see a bit of my home office behind me. I'm sure many of you are now working from home, especially with the COVID-19 situation. And I'm sure many of you are also self-quarantining, self-isolating, sequestering, or sheltering in place. So these four words we're hearing quite commonly in the social media and on the news. They are essentially being used interchangeably, but there are differences in meanings, and so I'm going to go through them now and throw in a bit of history of the origin of the words. So when we start with self-quarantining, now here in Canada, it tends to mean um, someone self quarantines when they've traveled from another country coming back to Canada, or they've come in contact with someone that has traveled or may have signs of the disease, or simply that they're just being very cautious and they want to protect themselves. Initially, various countries talked about self quarantining for about 14 days, but the word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta, which means 40. So way back when they started using the idea of quarantining, it was in the 1300s, and there was the Black Plague, which was ravaging Europe. Now, at the time, they weren't 100% sure what was happening. They thought maybe God was mad at them, or there was a number of possible hypotheses of why suddenly this plague was killing people. And they realized that some of the ships coming in from Asia via Egypt into the ports of Genoa and Venice in Italy had crew members who seemed to have the plague, the disease that was going around. So they ended up making these ships stay offshore, still at sea with their anchors weighed, for 40 days in order to see that all was clear, and only then could the people on the ship come aboard and come onto land, I should say. So this word came more into English around the 15th century, but it was more a religious meaning. It was used to describe the desert in which Jesus wandered for 40 days. And it was quarantine with a Y. So instead of Tine at the end, it was Tyne. And then around 1520, it was being used almost like a legal term. It was the 40-day period that a widow was allowed to stay in her dead husband's house while the relatives of the husband were trying to figure out what to do with his property. And nowadays, of course, we use it to mean strict isolation to prevent the spread of disease, and it doesn't really matter the timing. It could be 14 days or it could be 40 or anywhere in between. Now, isolation here, it tends to mean you go into isolation if you've had a positive result with the COVID-19 test, and you really do have to stay away from others. So whether you're in the hospital or whether you are at home, you have to be able to stay away completely from other people. And a good example of this, at least at home, is with our Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada. His wife ended up with a positive result while she was probably from visiting Europe and England during a conference. And so she is self-isolating in their home. He himself, after, he's had the test, he's negative. So he is self-quarantining. They're in the same home, but she's in a separate area. She's self-isolating. And the idea of isolation comes from the old French verb isoler, which is still used today. At the time, it specifically meant to stand detached from others of the same kind. It was first used in English in 1740, and at that point, it was still seen as a borrowed word or a foreign word used suddenly in English. And the first known case of it was someone describing China as a country that was isolated or standing apart from other countries. Sequestering, this comes from the Latin word sequestrare, which means to place in safekeeping. And that word in turn comes from another Latin word, sequester, which can stand for a trustee or a mediator. And the initial part, sec, stands for the idea of seizing something or taking something. So to hand something over to a trustee. Now, often we think of nuns and monks being sequestered, kind of away from the world, or a jury for a court case also being sequestered so that there's no, I guess, external influence or information from the outside world. But here it's being used with the virus in terms of removing or withdrawing oneself in order to stay in solitude and not pass on the disease. And the last one, sheltering in place, when I first heard it as a Canadian, I'd only heard it in the American context, basically when there was either a case of a shooting incident or a chemical or nuclear accident, where the people were expected to get to a safe place where they were. So, not necessarily going home, but if they were, say, in an office building, to find a room, preferably without windows, in the case of a shooter, to stay there until they had the all clear that they could leave. And I think of back in 2017 when there was the shooter in Las Vegas, at that big outdoor concert. I had a friend who was nearby there in a theater watching a show, and they were sequestered. Sorry, not sequestered. They were sheltered in place in the theater um, for hours, and they could not move until there was completely and all clear that it was safe for them to go back to their hotel. So in this case now, shelter in place is being used essentially in America, in the States, to mean to stay home and only go out when, you have to get the essentials or go to the doctor or hospital. So whether you prefer the word self-quarantining, self-isolating, sequestering, or sheltering in place, basically just take heed and stay home. And thanks for listening. In the meantime, stay safe and remember we're all in this together. Thank you.